I sold my company, Halberg Dynamics, for $46 million and decided to celebrate with my daughter and her husband. I booked a table at Harbor Light Pavilion, the kind of restaurant where the candles cost more than dinner used to. When they got up to dance, a security guard leaned toward me and said quietly, "Sir, I just saw your son-in-law pour something into your drink." Sevens. The band kept playing. My hand stayed steady. I smiled, thanked him, and stood. If I'm wrong, I'll ruin a family. If I'm right, I'll save my life. If I fail today, I'll lose the clean exit I've earned, and maybe my life before I ever get to use it. If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. The host led us past a wall of glass where the harbor lights smeared themselves across the water like melted coins. The place was all velvet light and quiet money. You could tell a restaurant by its chairs. These sighed when you sat. The kind of place where people ordered confidence by the bottle. My name's Edward Hale, 69 years old, founder of a company called Halberg Dynamics, a name that once meant something to people who spoke in code and circuits. For 30 years, I built systems that made other companies faster, smarter, colder. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what enough looked like. Tonight was supposed to fix that. Across the table, my daughter Elena beamed. She had her mother's eyes, warm brown, restless. She wore the kind of smile that made other people soften their posture. Her husband, Ryan, smoothed his tie, a habit that meant he wanted to look like a man who had everything under control. "Dad," he said as soon as we sat, "Elena tells me the deal's final." "It is," I said, unfolding my napkin like it was a contract I'd already signed. "Closed this afternoon." "That's incredible," he said. 46 million. You built an empire." "I built a company," I corrected. "Empires fall. Companies sell." He laughed too loudly for the room. Elena squeezed his hand to quiet him, but he mistook it for affection. I'd seen that mistake before. Men who thought approval was the same as love. The waiter appeared, smooth and invisible. Ryan ordered the most expensive scotch on the list, the way men do when they want to mark territory. Elena asked for white wine. I asked for orange juice, because my heart had started keeping its own calendar years ago. Ryan raised his glass. "To Edward Hale," he said, "the man who taught me what real work looks like." The scotch glowed like liquid ambition. I lifted my glass of juice. "To the people who remind me it's okay to stop working," I said. We clinked. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I looked at him and saw a version of myself from 25 years ago, confident, polished, certain that control was the same thing as safety. He worked in marketing, which meant he was fluent in compliments and allergic to silence. "Have you thought about what's next?" he asked. "Sleeping in," I said. He laughed again, but Elena didn't. She knew I wasn't joking. Ryan leaned in, voice lower. "If you ever get restless, there's always consulting, or maybe mentoring. People would pay a fortune for your brain." "I've sold my brain enough," I said. "I'd like to see if it still dreams." Elena smiled softly. She'd heard that tone before, the one I used when I meant to end a conversation without making a scene. The waiter brought bread, butter like glass sculpture, and plates that looked too clean to eat from. Outside, the harbor moved with the lazy confidence of money already spent. 46 million, Ryan repeated, shaking his head. You must feel unstoppable. No, I said. I feel finished. He blinked, like he'd never heard that word used with pride. The evening was supposed to be simple. Dinner, a few polite questions about retirement, and maybe a quiet drive home. Instead, Ryan kept steering the talk towards structure and succession. I was thinking, he said, maybe you should let me help manage some of the transition. You know, just to keep things efficient. I have attorneys for that, I said. Of course, he said, but family should be involved. It keeps things aligned. Aligned. The kind of word you learn in boardrooms and forget in real life. Elena cut in. Ryan, stop working for one night. Dad's earned peace. Her voice carried that small edge, the same one her mother used to use when she was trying to rescue me from my own stubbornness. I wanted to tell her not to bother. That stubbornness is the only inheritance I'm certain I'll leave behind. The band started to play. Slow, easy jazz. The kind of music that lets people pretend they have rhythm. Ryan reached for Elena's hand. Come on, he said. She hesitated, looked at me. You'll be all right? Always, I said. Go dance. They moved toward the floor, graceful in that way youth can afford to be. Her dress caught the light like a whisper. Ryan smiled like a man who believed the whole world was watching him. I turned back to my glass. The condensation had formed a perfect ring on the linen. I was tracing it with my finger when a shadow fell across the table. A man in a black suit, tall, composed, stood just beyond the candlelight. Not the kind of man who asked for tips. Mr. Hale? He said, voice low. Yes. He touched a badge near his belt. Security, sir. I wouldn't drink from that glass again. For a second, my hearing went somewhere else, a place behind the noise. Why? I saw the younger man pour something into it, he said. Clear liquid, small vial. The room didn't move, but the air changed shape. I looked toward the dance floor. Elena's head was on Ryan's shoulder. Her smile was unguarded. His wasn't. You're certain? I asked. Yes, sir. I've seen that motion before. My first instinct was disbelief. My second was memory. All the times Ryan had asked about access, documents, accounts. I'd called it curiosity. Maybe it was research. Thank you, I said quietly. Should I call the police? Not yet, I said. Let's not waste good music. He nodded once and disappeared back into the rhythm of the room. I looked at the glass again. The juice had gone still, like it was holding its breath. I stared at that glass long enough to see my reflection curve inside it. Men my age don't panic. Our bodies don't have the spare heartbeats for that. Instead, I did what 69 years of business and disappointment had trained me to do. I took inventory. Jacket, wallet, pill bottle with my heart medication. Small, white, harmless. I unscrewed the cap beneath the table and poured a bit of the orange juice into it, just enough for a test. The sound was so soft it could have been a sigh. The plant beside me was green and decorative. like most things meant to make guilt look alive. I watered it with the rest of the drink, one hand steady, the other pretending to straighten the napkin. When Elena and Ryan came back, I had already folded my napkin and set the glass aside, empty. "You finished that fast," Ryan said, a note of surprise hiding behind politeness. "Thirsty," I said. "Age does that." He smiled, thin, uncertain, then kissed Elena's hand, as if rehearsing decency. We talked about small things for the rest of dinner. Houses we'd never buy, trips we'd never take, and jokes I laughed at because not laughing would have asked too many questions. When the bill came, I paid in cash, an old habit from the days before trust was a word people leased. At the door, Elena hugged me, the kind that lasts exactly one heartbeat longer than guilt. "Get some rest, Dad," she said. "I will," I told her. I always keep my promises, even the ones I make quietly. The night outside was cleaner than I deserved. The harbor wind moved like something that didn't owe anyone money. My hands were steady, but my pulse had a plan of its own. I drove home slower than usual, not from fear, but from calculation. Anger is like alcohol. You can't operate heavy machinery under its influence. I let the city's lights pass like polite strangers. Inside my condo, the silence felt expensive. I turned on the lamp by my desk, the one that used to stay on for code reviews and strategy calls. Tonight, it lit something simpler. A small plastic bottle half filled with orange liquid. I labeled it in my handwriting. Sevens, Sample A, Harbor Light Pavilion, 8, 46 p.m. Then I set it in my safe beside old contracts, my passport, and a photograph of my late wife, Margaret, taken in a time when our daughter still believed money could buy safety. I poured myself water, the only thing I trusted, and sat by the window. The city was a collection of people who believed they'd earned tomorrow. Ryan had always admired that certainty in me. Maybe that's why he wanted to take it. The next morning came gray and obedient. I was up before the sun, dressed before reason. My list had 3 words on it: Sevens lab, lawyer, locks. The lab was discreet, the kind of place that doesn't ask why someone shows up with evidence instead of illness. "I need a full toxicology," I said. "Chain of custody. Signed, Svevens." The clerk nodded. She'd seen worse stories told in smaller bottles. I watched her label it with calm hands. Machines hummed in the background, the sound of truth being processed slowly enough to matter. When I stepped outside, the sky had decided to be blue after all. I called Rachel Moore, my attorney, the only person who'd ever told me no and made me grateful for it. She answered on the second ring. "Edward," she said, "you sound early." "Sevens?" "I'm alive," I said. "That feels new." By noon, I was sitting in her office, sunlight crossing the desk like evidence. I told her everything: the dinner, the guard, the glass. She listened without blinking, the way good lawyers do when disbelief is a luxury. "Do you want to involve the police?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "I want facts, not noise." Sevens. She nodded, made a note, and slid a document across the table. "Then we move fast. You're about to become your own firewall." I smiled for the first time that day. "I built systems my whole life," I said. "Might as well build one for me." That night, back home, I checked the locks twice before turning off the lights. The city moved outside my window, unaware that one of its older men had quietly declared war in a 3-word memo. Civitn, lab, lawyer, locks. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was just preparation. And in my world, preparation was always the first kindness before the storm. By the time I reached Rachel's office again the next day, the lab had already called twice. I let the first ring die out, just to make sure when I picked up, I'd hear certainty instead of curiosity. I've learned that some truths need a full breath before they enter the room. Mr. Hale, the chemist said when I finally answered, "We've completed the preliminary toxicology screen." His voice carried that practiced neutrality, the kind used by professionals who know the weight of what they're about to say. "We detected a benzodiazepine compound," he continued, "and trace amounts of warfarin." For a second, the air seemed to lose its edges. I didn't speak. I let the words drift through the receiver, settle, and attach themselves to the part of me that still pretended this might all be a misunderstanding. "Confirm chain of custody," I said finally. My voice sounded like someone else's. Calm, rehearsed, careful. "Signed and logged, sir. Full report will be ready within 3 hours. "Good. Email a copy to my attorney as well." "Yes, Mr. Hale." I ended the call. The silence in the room thickened, steady as fog. I've been angry before, at competitors, at board members, even at God once or twice. But this wasn't anger. This was arithmetic. Simple, cruel math. My son-in-law had tried to sedate me while my daughter danced beside him. There are moments when rage feels too small for the occasion. This was one of them. I straightened my tie, took one long breath, and walked into Rachel's office. Her door was glass, clean lines, no secrets. Inside, sunlight hit the corners like it was inspecting her for honesty. Rachel looked up from a stack of contracts, expression flat but curious. She reads people the way other lawyers read numbers, efficiently, without decoration. "Morning," she said. "You look like a man who already knows the results." "I do," I said. She set her pen down. "Tell me." So I did. From the restaurant to the whisper at my table, from the glass to the vial now sitting in a cold storage locker. I told her everything, slowly, without color. I've learned adjectives belong to people who want pity. Nouns belong to people who want justice. When I finished, Rachel leaned back in her chair, eyes tracing some private equation in the air. Then she nodded once, as if the world had just shifted one step closer to something irreversible. "All right," she said quietly. "We move to containment." "Meaning." "To meaning," she said, folding her hands. "We stop the fire before it spreads. Money, authority, access. Everything that can burn gets surrounded by stone. You're about to stop being a man and start being a vault." I studied her for a moment. Her tone was clinical, but her eyes had that faint edge of pity people try to hide behind professionalism. "I've been a vault before," I said. "Built one, actually. Digital, not moral. The difference is maintenance." Rachel smiled faintly, the first trace of warmth I'd seen all morning. Then you already know to keep the combination to yourself. Her pen began moving again, quick, confident. Each stroke another small defense against betrayal. As she wrote, I watched the skyline beyond her office window, cranes, glass, and the skeletons of future towers. Once, that view had looked like ambition. Today it looked like camouflage for greed. She looked up again. You understand what comes next? Yes, I said. We make me untouchable. Rachel nodded. Then let's start building your firewall, Mr. Hale. One signature at a time. Sevens. Rachel wasted no time. She never does. Efficiency is her version of mercy. First, she said, we revoke every power of attorney you've ever signed. I don't care if it's for a doctor, a broker, or a grocery delivery service. Nothing moves without your direct voice. She slid a folder across the desk. Second, your bank access. We issue immediate revocation of any shared authorization, digital or physical. You'll have to visit in person for final confirmation. I nodded. Third. Her pen didn't pause. Third, we move all your liquidity, the sale funds, into a temporary attorney escrow account. It'll sit there until we structure a trust. Right now, you're exposed. Ryan could still claim emergency access under family guardianship provisions. That word, guardianship, hit differently when it's used against you. Rachel kept talking, her tone factual but laced with an undertone of protective precision. We build firewalls, she said. You taught me something years ago when you audited my startup client. Remember? You said, security isn't paranoia. It's hygiene. I smiled faintly. I was a younger man then. Then wash your hands again, she said, pushing the documents closer. The signatures felt heavier than they should have. I've signed contracts worth millions, deals that moved entire product lines, but this was the first time my name felt like armor. By the time the paralegal returned, we'd built a paper fortress around my life. Rachel reviewed each document like a surgeon checking her sutures. When it was done, she leaned back and looked at me over her glasses. You've just made yourself untouchable. I exhaled, slow. Untouchable, I said. Or alone. Her voice softened. Sometimes those are synonyms. She stood, crossed to the window, and stared at the skyline for a long second before speaking again. You're handling this well. I'm not handling it, I said. I'm documenting it. At noon, I went to my bank, Everline Capital, the same institution that used to send me birthday cards and early access invitations for products I didn't need. The branch manager, Ms. Whitaker, greeted me with the kind of smile that banks reserve for customers whose interest payments could fund her department's coffee budget. Mr. Hale, she said, it's been too long. Not long enough, I said. She gestured to a private office. I followed. The air smelled like paper and politeness. What can we do for you today? She asked. I need to make sure no one else can do anything for me, I said. That wiped the professional cheer from her face. Understood. May I ask what prompted? You may not, I said, and she nodded, A quick, almost grateful gesture from someone relieved to be told what not to know. She logged into her terminal. "All right, Mr. Hale, let's verify your authorizations." Her fingers stilled on the keyboard. "Sir, this is odd." I waited. "It appears your account requires dual confirmation for transactions above $5 million. The second confirmation is assigned to Ryan Carter." I didn't react. Stillness is the older man's version of violence. "When was that change made?" I asked. 11 months ago, she said carefully. "It seems to have originated from your home network." "Remove it," I said. "I'll need to escalate that to compliance." "Then escalate." She did, quietly, with the brisk shame of someone erasing a mistake she hadn't made but wished she could apologize for. When it was done, she printed a confirmation slip and slid it across the desk. "All security protocols reverted to single-party authorization." "Good," I said. "Now I want a cashier's check for the full sale amount." Her eyes flicked up. "That's quite a sum, Mr. Hale." "Money only matters when it moves," I said. "Today, it moves." She typed faster. A printer hummed. The check emerged like a verdict. Black ink on pale paper. A map of every hour I'd ever traded for stability. I folded it once, precisely, and slipped it into my inner jacket pocket. It fit there like it belonged to the version of me that still trusted his reflection. On my way out, Ms. Whitaker called after me. "Mr. Hale?" I turned. She hesitated, then said quietly, "You're doing the right thing. Most men wait too long to protect themselves from family." I didn't answer. Some truths are too sharp to touch twice. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the glass of the building and broke itself into 1,000 smaller versions. All bright, all temporary. In that fractured light, I understood what Rachel meant by containment. When you've been betrayed, you don't rebuild the bridge. You burn it carefully and keep the ashes as proof you knew when to stop crossing. It was nearly 6 when my phone rang. Unknown number. I watched it buzz across the table like a restless thought. By the third ring, I answered. "Dad?" Ryan's voice. Smooth, practiced. The kind of voice that sells both sympathy and real estate. "Elena said you've been quiet. Everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Good, good." He drew the word out, testing the distance between us. "She worries, you know. You've had a lot on your plate. The sale, the transition, all that pressure. We just want to make sure you're well." "Well," I said. "That's a flexible term, Ryan." He laughed, soft and managerial. "Still sharp, huh? Look, I was thinking, why don't we come by tonight? Just dinner. No business talk. I'll bring a bottle of that Syrah you like." I leaned back, let the silence fill its shape. He'd never remembered the name of a wine in his life. "Not tonight," I said. He paused long enough for calculation. I could hear the quiet hum of whatever script he was flipping through in his head. "Come on, Ed," he said finally, switching to my first name like it was a handshake. Don't make this bigger than it is. Nothing's big, I said. Some things are just final. A beat. Then the tone shifted, the salesman's warmth thinning into warning. You've always loved control, he said. And you've always mistaken patience for weakness, I replied. He laughed again, but the sound had corners now. I get it. You're stressed. The sale must feel like losing part of yourself. That can mess with a man's judgment. Fortunately, I said, I sold the part of me that trusted other people's judgment years ago. There was a rustle on the line. I imagined him pacing, the way he always did when conversation stopped obeying him. Look, he said finally, I don't want this to get weird between us. It already is. You don't mean that. Actually, I said, I do. I just mean it quietly. He tried to recover, offering that soft chuckle men use when they want to erase what they just heard. We'll talk soon, he said. Face to face. Of course, I said, and ended the call. The screen went black, and for a moment, so did the part of me that used to believe civility could save anything. I set the phone on the table beside the check, $46 million in clean exit money, and realized both objects had the same flaw. They were silent until someone decided to use them. I poured a glass of water, drank half, and looked out over the city. The skyline was a barcode of glass and steel, a system I'd once believed was unhackable. Everything breaks eventually. You just have to know where to tap. That night, I opened my safe. The vial sat there like a confession that hadn't yet been read. Next to it, my late wife's photograph, Margaret, smiling in a way that forgave every sin except laziness. You'd hate what this is turning into, I said softly. But you'd understand why it has to. I took the vial and sealed it in a padded envelope labeled Sevens, Sample A, Retain. Chain of custody verified. Witnessed by counsel. Then I placed it into a newly rented safe deposit box, one of two that Rachel had arranged. The second would hold duplicates of every document I'd signed that week. 2 locations, 2 locks, 2 versions of me, one that built things, one that now protected them. At 1:0 a.m. The city outside was half asleep and half pretending to be. I sat by the window with a notebook and wrote 3 lines. Confirm final report. Transfer funds to escrow. Decide confrontation venue. When I finished, I underlined the last one twice. If a man plans to set fire to your life, it's only fair to invite him to watch you build the firebreak. I closed the notebook, set it on the table beside the empty glass, and smiled for the first time that day. Preparation wasn't revenge yet, but it was the part that made revenge honest. Rachel called just after 8 the next morning. Her voice was clipped, alert, the sound of someone who doesn't waste adrenaline on panic. The lab confirmed the full report, she said. Benzodiazepine, warfarin, concentrations consistent with deliberate adulteration. Deliberate, I repeated. Not accident, not coincidence. Not even creative, she said. Just lethal. The words settled like metal in my stomach. This is an attempted homicide, Edward. I looked out the window at the gray skyline, at the cranes pretending to build new things. Let's not use that word yet, I said. Words are like triggers. You only pull them once. Rachel exhaled softly. What do you want to do? I want to show him what a clean version of revenge looks like. That's not in the criminal code, she said. I've written my own language before. By noon, the plan had taken shape. Rachel would prepare every legal boundary, funds locked, accounts segregated, ownership fully transferred to escrow. My job was simpler: to choose the battlefield. There's an art to confrontation. You don't call the enemy into your home. You make them come to the scene of the crime. I called Elena that afternoon. Dinner tonight, I said. Just us. She hesitated. At your place? No, I said. At Harbor Light Pavilion. 6:30. Same table by the window. Oh, she said, her voice brightening. Ryan will be happy. He's been trying to make things right. I bet he has. She didn't catch the tone. She never did when love and warning shared a sentence. I arrived an hour early. Harbor Light Pavilion hadn't changed. Polished glass, soft jazz, staff that moved like choreography. The same scent of citrus and money. The host recognized me immediately. Mr. Hale, good to see you again. Likewise, I said. Is Mr. Riley on shift tonight? He checked discreetly. Yes, sir. Would you like him to stop by? Just to say hello, I said. When Riley arrived, he looked the way he had the night that saved me. Sharp eyes, steady hands, no dramatics. Evening, Mr. Hale. You're the reason I'm still having evenings, I said. He gave a modest nod. Just doing my job. Tonight, I said quietly, I may need you to do it again. Not for safety, for truth. Understood. He didn't ask for details. The best men rarely do. By the time Elena and Ryan arrived, the sun had already begun to slide behind the water. The light caught her hair just enough to make her look 15 again. Curious, kind, full of belief. I wondered how much of that he'd spent. Dad, she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. You look better than you did last week. Good lighting, I said. Ryan extended his hand. Edward, he said, smiling. Glad you called. We've been worried. I shook his hand. His grip was strong, but there was hesitation beneath the pressure. The kind men get when they don't know how much you know. I thought we should have dinner, I said. Talk things through. Perfect idea, he said. He gestured toward the bar. Wine? I'll pass. I'm keeping a clear head tonight. The host seated us at the same table, the same view, the same distance between the glasses. Only the danger had changed its outfit. The waiter arrived, offering menus like peace treaties. I ordered something light. They didn't look at the menu. Guilty people rarely do. Elena reached across the table. Dad, I'm glad you called. Things have been tense. Ryan didn't mean to upset you. Upset? I asked softly. That's such a young word. I'm long past upset. Ryan's smile tightened. Then this is good. Closure. We can move on. Closure's just a polite word for evidence, I said. He blinked. What's that supposed to mean? You'll find out before dessert. He chuckled awkwardly, glancing at Elena. He's teasing. Am I? I asked, and leaned back, letting the candlelight catch the folder I'd placed beside my plate. The air between us changed temperature. Even the silverware noticed. The food arrived, though no one touched it. Steam rose from the plates and died quietly in the air, the way warmth always does when truth is in the room. Ryan filled his own glass, then Elena's. To family, he said, lifting it slightly. To second chances. I didn't raise mine. Second chances are for people who make first mistakes, I said. This isn't one of those. His hand froze mid-air. What's that supposed to mean? I slid the folder onto the table, opened it slowly. Inside were 3 pages. The lab report, the chain of custody, and a signed statement from Mr. Riley. Elena looked at the papers, confused. Dad? Read it, I said softly. Both of you. Ryan's eyes moved across the text. He didn't need to reach the bottom to understand. His face changed, not in expression, but in temperature. This is insane, he said, forcing a laugh. You think I'd try to hurt you? You think I don't think, I said. I confirm. I turned slightly. Mr. Riley. He appeared at the edge of the table as if conjured by intention rather than voice. Calm, professional, deliberate. Yes, Mr. Hale. Would you repeat what you told me that night? Ryan's jaw tightened. What is this? Riley didn't look at him. I observed Mr. Carter pour a clear liquid into Mr. Holmes Hale's drink while he was watching the band. I informed him immediately. Elena's breath caught. She looked from Riley to Ryan, her eyes wide, pleading. Ryan, tell me he's lying. Ryan tried to smile, but it came out broken. He's mistaken. Maybe it was water. Maybe. Water doesn't test positive for benzodiazepines and warfarin, I said, unless the oceans changed formula. Dad, stop! Elena's voice cracked. I can't, I said. Stopping is how this began. The waiter, sensing danger, disappeared with the kind of speed that belongs to survival instinct. The rest of the restaurant pretended not to notice us. That's how decency works. It hides when truth starts speaking. Ryan leaned forward, voice low, rehearsed. You're misinterpreting everything. You've been under a lot of stress. Selling the company. This isn't about business, I said. It's about arithmetic. You added greed to fear and expected loyalty as the result. He laughed softly, that salesman laugh again. You're losing it. Am I? I slid a small USB drive from my pocket and placed it beside the folder. That's the camera footage. It shows what the report already proved. He stared at it, and for the first time since I'd known him, he stopped performing. Elena's hands trembled. "Why?" she whispered. Ryan opened his mouth, but the sentence never formed. Guilt's first symptom is language failure. "I trusted you with her," I said quietly. "You thought I was trusting you with my money." He tried one last time to recover, his tone shifting to something almost pleading. "We were worried about you, Ed. You've been forgetful, paranoid, talking to lawyers. We thought... You thought you'd help me die before I could update my will." No one spoke. The quartet near the bar changed songs, oblivious, their notes stretching across the room like distant sirens. I looked at Elena. "You have a choice. You can believe the man who almost killed your father, or the man who kept you alive long enough to watch him fail." Tears found her, but not the kind that wash things clean, the kind that sting. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I believe you," I said. "That's why you'll be fine when this ends." Ryan stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You're insane. I'm leaving." "No," I said. "You're finished." Mr. Riley moved subtly into his path, not blocking him, just standing there, the way decency sometimes does when it finally grows a backbone. Ryan looked at me, jaw tight, eyes bright with the kind of rage only cornered men know. "You'll regret this," he said. "I already regret raising my standards too late." He left without looking back. Elena sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. I placed a folded napkin beside her hand, a father's reflex. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "I take what's left of our family and put it somewhere safe, where signatures can't poison it." I stood, nodded once to Mr. Riley, and left the restaurant. Outside, the evening air tasted cleaner than it had in months. The harbor lights rippled like a system rebooting itself. For the first time since the sale, I wasn't just free, I was certain. The morning arrived like an apology, pale, quiet, and too gentle for what had happened the night before. I woke before the alarm, not because I couldn't sleep, but because my body had decided there was nothing left to rest from. The apartment felt different, still mine, but stripped of assumption. The kind of silence that follows after a house fire when the flames are gone and the air still smells of what almost was. I poured a glass of water and watched the light hit it. For a long moment, I just stood there, letting the ordinary save me. No sirens, no shouting, no poison waiting in a glass. Just water, clear, obedient, unambitious. On the counter lay yesterday's list. Lab, lawyer, locks. I picked up the pen and added a fourth word underneath, slow and deliberate. Legacy. The first three had kept me alive. The last would decide what kind of life that survival was worth. I checked the camera feeds on my phone. The night had behaved. No visitors. No shadows that moved without names. The new deadbolts blinked a calm green, like tiny sentinels confirming that dignity still had a home address. Outside, The city looked normal. Joggers, coffee cups, headlines. The world forgets quickly. That's its best defense mechanism. But men like me, we remember. We catalog. We build order out of smoke. By 7, I was dressed. The same navy suit I'd worn the day I sold the company. The one that still smelled faintly of champagne and closure. Funny thing about closure, it has an expiration date. I buttoned the jacket, not for vanity, but for armor. Every thread meant I was still the man who could finish things cleanly. The phone buzzed. Rachel. "You slept?" she asked. "I practiced," I said. She laughed softly, that dry, tired sound lawyers make when they've seen the anatomy of disaster too many times. "Today we finished the firewall," she said. "Bank notices, trust paperwork, beneficiary transfers. After this, Ryan can't touch a cent. And if he tries, then he gets paper cuts from the law itself," she said. I almost smiled. Good. I've bled enough for both of us. Breakfast was a formality. Toast, black coffee, one pill. I ate like a man rehearsing normalcy. While the toaster cooled, I opened the blinds and let sunlight in. It crawled across the floor, warm and undeserved. I thought of Margaret, my late wife, and how she used to talk about mornings as if they were moral tests. "You don't earn a sunrise," she'd say. "You just try not to waste it." I wondered what she'd say now, if she saw her husband alive because he'd learned to read deceit the way she once read recipes, carefully, measuring each ounce of trust. I sat at my desk and reviewed the files Rachel had sent overnight. Trust formation documents, beneficiary revisions, letters of revocation. Each page was a small gravestone for the version of me that believed loyalty could substitute for contracts. The pen moved easily this time. My signature was steady, somewhere between exhaustion and enlightenment. After the last page, I leaned back and let the chair creak, a sound that reminded me of boardrooms, negotiations, of everything I used to mistake for meaning. At 9, I locked the door behind me, tugged the handle twice, and whispered to no one in particular, still holding. In the elevator mirror, I saw a man who looked exactly his age but twice as awake. Not angry, not afraid, just aware. Down in the lobby, the guard greeted me. "Morning, Mr. Hale." "Morning," I said. "Any incidents overnight?" "None, sir. Cameras clean." "Good," I said. "Let's keep it that way." He nodded, professional, unaware he'd just participated in a ceremony of quiet gratitude. Outside, the air carried that crisp honesty only cities have right before they remember how to lie again. I walked 3 blocks toward Rachel's office, the check still in my inside pocket, a silent reminder that freedom has weight. Each step felt deliberate. One for the betrayal, one for the proof, one for the second chance I hadn't asked for but somehow received. At the corner light, a man crossed holding his child's hand. The kid skipped, laughing at something invisible. For a second, envy and mercy shared the same breath inside me. Not every father gets to start over. Most don't survive long enough to realize they need to. By the time I reached the office building, I felt lighter, not safe, but functional. Rachel met me at the door, files in one arm, determination in the other. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," I said. "Yesterday was survival. Today we make it mean something." She smiled. "That's a dangerous kind of optimism, Edward." "It's the only kind left." And as we stepped into the elevator, I felt the shift, the precise moment when fear stopped being my language and structure became my revenge. Rachel's office smelled like ink and deadlines. She'd already cleared her morning, no calls, no interruptions. The kind of silence that only lawyers and surgeons know. Focused, final. On her desk, 2 stacks of folders waited like opposing armies. One was labeled old, the other new. This, she said, tapping the first stack, is your life as it existed yesterday. Sevens. She tapped the second. And this is the version that gets to survive you. I nodded. Let's operate. The next 2 hours were all signatures and precision. She moved through the documents with surgical rhythm, revocation forms, new power of attorney clauses, corporate dissolutions. Every pen stroke felt like suturing an invisible wound. Your old estate plan had family as co-trustees, she said. Ryan as secondary executor. Not anymore, I said. She crossed his name out with a single line, deliberate and almost gentle. Done. Replacement? So no one with my DNA. She didn't argue. Good lawyers know where silence belongs. Then came the transfers, a choreography of codes, authorizations, and notarized instructions. We moved my assets into escrow accounts under her firm's oversight, away from every system Ryan could still touch. By the time we reached the last signature, I realized something strange. My hand no longer trembled. Fear and precision don't coexist. Only one gets to hold the pen. At noon, Rachel leaned back. That's the last of the immediate locks. Next comes the rebuild. Meaning? She opened a new folder, this one thinner but heavier in implication. A trust, she said. Revocable, with teeth. The Hale Legacy Trust. Independent trustee, controlled distributions. If you die tomorrow, Ryan gets nothing. Elena receives structured support under professional oversight. The rest goes to the foundation, I said, finishing for her. She smiled. You've been reading ahead. I nodded toward the window. I've spent my life building systems that outlast people. Now I'm just updating the code. Rachel looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, Edward, you realize what this is, right? You're dismantling everything that once defined you. I'm refining it, I said. Same difference, just cleaner syntax. After lunch, we moved to the digital front. Rachel's IT consultant joined us, a quiet woman named Kara, who handled data like it was classified religion. Ryan's still listed as a beneficiary contact on 2 of your accounts, she said, typing. I can revoke, but I'll need biometric confirmation. Do it, I said. She nodded, scanned my fingerprint, and executed the change. Done. He's ghosted. Ghosted, I repeated. Appropriate. Rachel smiled. You've just built the legal equivalent of a quarantine zone. I said. Infection prevention. By 3, the paperwork was sealed. Rachel exhaled and looked over her notes. Every asset, account, and authorization is now behind 3 walls of compliance. He can't touch you, or your money, without tripping federal wire alerts. Perfect, I said. If he tries, I want the system to leave fingerprints. You sound like a prosecutor. I sound like a man who's tired of being a victim. She closed her folder. Next step, the foundation. The Margaret Hale Foundation, I said. Education. Small grants. Nothing with my name on a building. Rachel raised an eyebrow. No legacy branding. That's rare for men with your resume. Legacy isn't a headline, I said. It's plumbing. You only notice when it stops working. She nodded, approving. Then we'll draft it that way. Quiet impact. No noise. Before I left, Rachel slid a thin envelope across the desk. Copies for your records, she said. If something happens to me, this file keeps you protected. But Edward, I looked up. But this kind of precision costs peace. You're sure you want to carry it? I smiled faintly. Peace is just order without witnesses. I can live with that. Outside, the city was changing color. Late afternoon gold washing over the glass towers. I walked past the bank that had once called me valued client and realized how hollow those words sound once you've stopped believing them. At a corner cafe, I watched strangers laugh over coffee, their worries still small enough to fit inside conversation. I envied them, not for their innocence, but for their ignorance. The world still hadn't noticed I was at war. That was fine. Quiet wars end cleaner. When I reached home, I double-locked the door, checked the bolts, and placed the new documents in the safe. There was no ceremony, just the soft click of metal finding its purpose. It sounded exactly like victory should. 7s, small, final, and private. The day after we sealed the trust, Rachel called with her voice half hidden behind the hum of paperwork. The bank approved the escrow split, she said. Now we formalize your foundation. The word foundation hung there for a moment, heavier than money, lighter than forgiveness. A name? She asked. The Margaret Hale Foundation, I said. For education, trees, and people who need help without needing to explain why. Rachel smiled faintly. No naming rights? No scholarship gala? No press? No, I said. No statues. No speeches. Just shade. She tilted her head. Shade. My wife used to say the best trees are the ones that never get plaques. They just make it easier for strangers to stand still. Her office became a workshop of reinvention. Legal language replaced grief, clause by clause. Purpose, she dictated to her assistant, to provide quiet grants to individuals and organizations serving education, urban reforestation, and transitional care programs. No publicity, no recognition requirement. Each word felt like planting something invisible. For years, I'd built things meant to scale, algorithms, systems, companies. But this wasn't meant to grow. It was meant to end well. I watched her type initial endowment, Anind Schunonongslers, and for the first time, the number didn't look like armor. It looked like soil. At noon, we met with the bank's charitable division. The vice president, a man with polished vowels and cautious eyes, shook my hand like someone handling a fragile check. Mr. Hale, the foundation charter looks unconventional, he said. Most donors prefer public recognition. So that's because most donors confuse immortality with branding, I said. I'm not trying to live forever. I'm trying to be useful while I'm still breathing. He didn't know where to file that sentence. Few bankers do. Rachel cut in smoothly. All necessary compliance documents are in order. The endowment will be funded in 2 tranches, the first today, the second after beneficiary transfers clear. He nodded, stamped, and signed. The sound of rubber on paper, thump, felt like punctuation on a life sentence finally commuted. After the meeting, we walked 3 blocks to the water. Rachel carried her briefcase. I carried nothing. Why trees? She asked. Why not something shinier? Cancer research, AI ethics, scholarships? Because trees don't ask for credit, I said. And because my wife planted one in every city we ever lived in. She said it reminded her that even transient lives can leave permanent shade. She looked at me, half smiling. That's almost poetic, Edward. Almost, I said, but not enough to forgive what happened. That's not what shade is for, she said. We stood there for a while, watching the wind move across the harbor, the same water that had mirrored poison just days before. Now it only reflected sunlight, as if the city itself were trying to apologize. By mid-afternoon, the Margaret Hale Foundation officially existed. A tax ID number, a bank account, a governing charter, cold proof that kindness can be engineered if you're stubborn enough. Rachel handed me a copy of the certificate. You're now the founder of something that doesn't need you, she said. Perfect, I said. That's how everything worth building should end. We returned to her office to finish one last document, the letter of wishes. It wasn't a will. It wasn't law. It was guidance for the trustees after I was gone. What do you want it to say? She asked. I thought for a long time. Then I dictated. No plaques. No dinners. No names. Support projects that make strangers breathe easier. Fund the small, the quiet, the unphotographed. Rachel's pen slowed near the end. You really don't want your name attached to any of this? My name's already attached to too many mistakes. She nodded, signed, and closed the folder. Then it's done. When I stepped outside, dusk was settling over the city. The light turned everything copper. Even the sidewalk looked valuable. I stopped by a park on my walk home. A maintenance crew was planting saplings, small enough to look breakable. One man tamped down the soil with his boot. He looked up and said, "It'll take time, but they'll catch." They always do, I said. He smiled without knowing why, then went back to work. I stood there a while, hands in pockets, watching a young tree hold its ground against the wind. Maybe that's all legacy really is. Seven's haughty, not the roots you leave behind. 7. But the air someone else gets to breathe because you decided not to burn everything down. The invitation went out on a Thursday afternoon. Just a short message. Dinner at Harborlight Pavilion. 7. My treat. No explanation. No emotion. Just punctuation. Elena replied within minutes. Of course, Dad. Ryan and I will be there. That was the problem with optimism. It made people walk straight into traps that weren't even hidden. I arrived early, as always. The same host greeted me, the same polite smile, the same background music that pretended not to have witnessed anything tragic. Mr. Hale, he said. Same table? Yes, I said. By the rail, if it's free. He led me there, and for a moment I could almost pretend the last 2 weeks hadn't happened, that this was just dinner with family. But the human mind is generous with delusion. It will repaint even the most poisoned memories if you give it good lighting. I placed 2 envelopes on the table, side by side, labeled A and B. They looked innocent, almost decorative. Truth often does. At 6:55, Mr. Riley appeared near the bar. He caught my eye and gave a small nod, quiet confirmation that order was present. Everything was ready. They arrived on time. Elena first, as always, punctuality inherited from her mother. She wore blue, the color she always chose when she wanted to look trustworthy. Ryan followed, confident as a man who still thought he had control over the narrative. Dad, Elena said, kissing my cheek. It's good to see you. You too, sweetheart, I said. Ryan. He shook my hand firmly. His smile was polished but not sealed. Fear had a way of leaking through enamel. This is nice, he said. I've been hoping we could clear the air. I gestured for them to sit. Air clears itself, I said. People, on the other hand, need help. He laughed nervously, as though waiting for me to match his tone. I didn't. The waiter came, all grace and timing. Still orange juice for you, sir? Yes, I said. And bring them whatever truth pairs best with red wine. Elena frowned a little. You're in a mood tonight. I'm in a moment, I corrected. They're shorter. The conversation began small. Weather, work, the foundation. Elena was proud when I mentioned it, until I said Margaret's name. Then the light in her eyes faltered. Guilt does that. It hates reminders of people who would have known better. Ryan lifted his glass. To the new beginning, he said. I let the silence answer. When the waiter retreated, I reached for the envelopes, placed them between the 3 of us. Do you know why I chose this place? I asked. Elena smiled gently. Because you love the view. Ryan added, because the food's good. Because this is where someone tried to kill me, I said. It was quiet for a long time. Not the kind of quiet that invites calm, the kind that measures what's left of a soul. Elena blinked fast, as if trying to understand a language she suddenly didn't speak. Dad, what are you talking about? Ryan set his glass down, too carefully. You're still on that? We've explained. You haven't explained, I said. You've denied. He tried to smile again, But this time the performance cracked. You can't prove anything. I could, I said. But I don't need to. Proof is for courtrooms. This is dinner. I opened the first envelope, A, and slid it toward him. Inside, a copy of the police-ready statement, the lab report, the security affidavit. He didn't touch it. People rarely touch their own indictments. Then I tapped the second envelope. B, I said. The better option. Agreements, boundaries, therapy, silence. No police, no court, no headlines. Just order. Elena whispered, Dad. I looked at her. Sweetheart, there's mercy in boundaries. The lack of them is what nearly buried me. Ryan's jaw tightened. This is blackmail. This is governance, I said. Mr. Riley had moved closer, invisible but unmistakable. His presence was like punctuation. It ended arguments before they started. The waiter returned, unsure whether to approach. I waved him off. Ryan stared at the envelopes, then at me. You're really going through with this? I already did, I said. Tonight's just the courtesy of informing you. Elena looked between us, tears rising but not yet falling. Dad, please, can we just talk? We are, I said. You're both just used to monologues. Ryan reached for the glass, then stopped himself. Smart. Finally. When the check arrived, I covered it in silence. You don't owe me for dinner, I said. Just for the truth. They stood, unsure how to leave. I gave them each a long look, not anger, not forgiveness, just documentation. Outside, the night air smelled like beginnings disguised as endings. Behind me, Harbor Light Pavilion glowed the way expensive places do, hiding sin under candlelight. I walked 3 blocks before I realized I hadn't looked back once. That's how you know revenge is working. 7. When the past finally stops asking for eye contact. They didn't speak for almost a minute after I mentioned the word kill. The sound of the quartet at the bar filled the gap. A slow, polite tune pretending it hadn't just witnessed a confession. Ryan looked at me the way people look at locked doors. You're serious, he said. I stopped being anything else years ago. Elena's hands shook. Dad, please, let's go home. This isn't you. No, I said. This is exactly me. You've just never met this version before. I tapped the envelopes again, side by side like a coin toss that only looked fair. 2 options, I said. A and B. We'll start with A. I opened the first envelope and read aloud, my voice steady, measured. Chain of custody report, signed by certified chemists. Security statement by Mr. Riley, eyewitness. Toxicology report. Benzodiazepine, warfarin. Intent confirmed. Chain sealed. Police ready. Ryan's jaw flexed once, twice, small movements, like a man negotiating with his own pulse. Well, that's your Exhibit A, I said. If I deliver it tomorrow, there will be a case number by noon. He stared down at the table. You'd really send your own family to prison? I already visited the alternative, I said. It looked like a coffin. He turned to Elena. Say something. But she just shook her head. I can't recognize you, she whispered. Neither could I, but the difference was, I liked the stranger I'd become. I slid the second envelope forward. B, I said. This one doesn't end in court. It ends in compliance. Ryan frowned. Compliance? Yes. You sign a legally binding agreement acknowledging 3 conditions. 1. You renounce any financial or fiduciary rights to my estate or company proceeds. 2. You and Elena will undergo therapy, real therapy, not the kind that issues polite notes, for 1 year, verified by my counsel. 3. You agree to permanent separation of finances. You get nothing directly from me, ever again. He laughed, brittle and wrong. That's not law. That's humiliation. Humiliation is temporary, I said. Integrity's permanent. I'm giving you the cheaper lesson. Elena spoke softly. And if we refuse, then we go back to A. Ryan's voice rose slightly. That's blackmail. No, I said. That's choice. Blackmail hides in shadows. I'm offering you this in public, under chandeliers. Mr. Riley moved a few steps closer, not intervening, just existing in the right place at the right time. Ryan saw him and looked away. You'll destroy Elena, he said. I'm saving her, I replied. From a man who tried to destroy what she came from. The silence that followed was sharper than any shouting could have been. The waiter reappeared, hesitant. Dessert, sir? No, I said. Just the check. He nodded and vanished again. Professionals know when to let tragedy pay quietly. Ryan leaned forward. You think this fixes anything? You'll be alone. I've been alone since you poured that glass, I said. This just makes it official. Elena started to cry. Quiet, dignified tears that embarrassed no one but herself. I didn't reach across the table. Some comfort feels like interference when truth is still speaking. Dad, she said between breaths, why can't you just let this end? Because endings that aren't structured become sequels, I said. Ryan picked up envelope B, weighed it like a man testing the heft of surrender. What's in here? He asked. A map, I said. One that doesn't lead to prison, or ruin, or me. He smiled weakly. You think you're teaching me something? I'm teaching the next person you might have hurt. He looked at Elena again. For the first time, she didn't look back. He exhaled, long and tired. What happens if I sign? You stop running, I said. You get therapy. You face yourself. You learn the cost of trying to kill a man who spent his life writing systems that catch errors. Mr. Riley brought the check and set it beside the envelopes. Ryan slid envelope A back toward me, then placed his hand on B. This doesn't mean I forgive you, he said. It doesn't require forgiveness. I said. It requires reading comprehension. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded once. Fine. I'll sign. Elena wiped her eyes. And me? You'll sign, too, I said. And you'll heal. That's the only inheritance I'm offering. When they left, the table looked untouched. 3 glasses, 1 bill, 2 envelopes, and the faint scent of citrus where my orange juice had been. I paid, left cash large enough to buy the waiter's silence and gratitude at once, and stood. Outside, the city was cold and clear, the kind of night where truth feels lighter than air. As I walked away, I thought about the difference between punishment and correction. Punishment ends people. Correction changes them. And I was finally learning how to choose the second without pretending it was mercy. They didn't move for a long while after Ryan said he'd signed. The sound of the quartet faded into something slow and mournful, a fitting soundtrack for people realizing they'd finally run out of versions of themselves. Elena stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Ryan just kept breathing too loudly, like air itself had turned into a negotiation. "Can we have a moment?" he asked. I nodded. "You can have 2. After that, the choice signs itself." He laughed under his breath, a brittle sound. "You always did think in deadlines." "Deadlines keep people honest," I said. "So do signatures." He turned to Elena. "He's bluffing," he whispered. "He doesn't want this going public any more than we do." I saw the look on his face, she said quietly. "He's not bluffing." Ryan leaned closer. "He's your father. He'll calm down." "No," she said. "He's my father. That's why we're still sitting here instead of in jail." Her words hit him harder than mine ever could. Some truths sound like betrayal until you realize they're rescue. He looked back at me. "You think this makes you noble?" "I think it makes me precise." "You're doing this to feel powerful." "No," I said. "I'm doing it to stop pretending weakness is a virtue." He scoffed, gesturing toward the envelopes. "You call this mercy?" "I call it management," I said. "You tried to kill a man who built operating systems for a living. Did you really think I wouldn't know how to debug a betrayal?" Elena pressed a trembling hand to her face. "Please, stop," she whispered. I looked at her gently. "He needs to hear it, sweetheart. So do you. Because people who hurt others often believe they're misunderstood. The truth is simpler. They're unexamined." Ryan pushed back from the table, his chair scraping the floor. "You can't lecture me. You raised her to be like you, cold, mechanical, distant. I was the one who made her feel human." Elena's head snapped toward him, eyes wet but steady. "You made me choose between loyalty and conscience." "That's love," he said. "No," she replied, voice breaking. "That's control." He went silent, the kind of silence that arrives when someone realizes the argument has changed rooms without them. "Mr." Riley shifted his stance by the doorway, a quiet shadow reminding us that witnesses are what keep justice from evaporating. I folded my hands. "Ryan, you should know something. Every document you'll sign tonight has already been filed in escrow. Whether you sign or not, the system has already accepted the version of you that fits inside it. He blinked. You can't. I already did, I said. You mistook my patience for permission. That's a common mistake in men who think intelligence means control. His mouth opened, then closed. For once, words didn't want him. Elena looked at me through tears. Dad, what happens after this? After this, I said, you start therapy. You rebuild yourself. Not for me, for your own reflection, and him. I nodded toward Ryan. He learns that survival isn't the same thing as victory. Ryan clenched his fists. You're enjoying this. No, I said. I'm documenting it. Enjoyment is temporary. Documentation is forever. He laughed once, hollow. You talk like a man writing his own eulogy. I am, I said. I just planned to read it myself. The waiter returned with the check, but nobody reached for it. I laid down enough cash to silence time itself. Ryan finally exhaled, slow and defeated. Fine, he said. You win. There's no winning here, I replied. Just accountability. Elena reached for the pen, her hand shaking slightly. Where do we sign? I slid the agreement forward. Bottom right, under the clause that says you understand what boundaries are for. She signed first. Her tears hit the paper, small circles of water that blurred the ink. Sometimes forgiveness looks like damage. Ryan hesitated, then signed too. His signature slanted, careless, like he was still hoping the law respected bad handwriting. When they were done, I folded the papers neatly and handed them to Mr. Riley. Deliver these to Ms. Moore's office, I said. He nodded and left, carrying the proof that restraint can be deadlier than rage. Elena stood, voice small. Will we see you again? After a year, I said. If you both show up to every therapy session and bring a fact, not an excuse. Ryan muttered, You think you're God. No, I said. God forgives too quickly. They walked out together, two silhouettes under a streetlight that didn't know which one deserved illumination. I stayed behind, finishing the last of my water. It tasted clean, honest, the opposite of what nearly killed me. When I stood, I looked once more at the empty chairs and whispered to no one, Justice served. And for the first time in months, the word served didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like balance. The city was asleep when I got home. Streetlights blinked like exhausted sentries, the kind of quiet that makes even a liar sound sincere. I locked the door, turned the bolt twice, and stood for a while in the dark. My reflection in the glass looked like someone I might actually trust. On the table sat two things, a fountain pen and a blank sheet of paper. Both had been waiting longer than I realized. I poured a glass of water, set it beside the paper, and exhaled. Tonight wasn't for plans or signatures. Tonight was for punctuation. I started simply. Elena, if you're reading this, it means I've chosen not to shout anymore. The first line decided the rest. I wrote slowly, the way surgeons move when they can't afford to bleed. I won't tell you what I felt when the truth arrived. Feelings belong to people who still expect fairness. I stopped expecting it the night I watched you dance with the man who tried to end me. The words weren't sharp, they were clean. There's a difference. I don't blame you for loving him. I blame myself for raising you to think love and safety were the same thing. I paused, let the pen rest, let my pulse slow. The apartment hummed softly. The fridge, the heater, the ghosts of habits that still hadn't learned they were unemployed. I continued. What happened between us is a kind of inheritance. You got your mother's compassion and my silence. Both are dangerous if left unsupervised. I smiled at that. Margaret would have approved the phrasing. You once told me that I lived too much in systems. You were right. But systems are the only things that don't lie when emotions do. That's why I built the boundaries you signed tonight. They're not bars. They're braces to hold up whatever is left of us. I leaned back and stared at the sentence. It looked right. It felt earned. I kept writing. Ryan will learn what responsibility feels like when it's no longer optional. You'll learn what forgiveness means when it's no longer cheap. And I'll learn what it's like to love without supervision. I hesitated, then added, You can still build something with me, just not out of me. That line landed harder than I expected. I let it sit there, ink drying slow, a small mercy, letting gravity do the rest. I turned to a fresh page. The foundation bears your mother's name because she believed kindness needed structure. You'll see her hand in every clause, even though she's been gone a decade. Maybe one day, when the guilt quiets, you'll join it. Not as a daughter trying to fix her father, but as a woman trying to keep the world from becoming him. My throat tightened then, the way it does when memory mistakes itself for oxygen. I let it pass. I won't ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness is for people who think they ran out of time. I still have some left, and I plan to use it on better things, trees, grants, quiet mornings that don't require explanations. I signed the letter, Dad, Sevens, then sat back and read it once, twice. No edits. I wanted it to sound like thought, not literature. When I folded it, the paper felt heavier than it should have, not from ink, but from decision. I slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote her name across the front. No, to my daughter. Just Elena. Names are for adults. Titles are for history. Before heading to bed, I placed the envelope in the safe, right beside the trust documents and the foundation charter. I knew Rachel would find it if I didn't wake up one morning. Lawyers are good at finding the things we forget to tell people. I turned off the lights, sat in the dark, and listened to the city breathing outside my window. For the first time since the sale, I didn't feel hunted by the past. I just felt like a man with fewer illusions and better paperwork. As I lay down, a thought arrived. Quiet, uninvited, true. Justice isn't about what happens to them. It's about who you refuse to become because of them. I smiled in the dark. The letter had done its job. It hadn't made peace. It had made room for it. It was 12:41 a.m. when my phone lit up. Building concierge flashed across the screen, the kind of call that knows you're awake even if you wish you weren't. Mr. Hale, the voice said, calm but alert. 2 individuals are at your door with a locksmith. They say it's emergency maintenance. The work order doesn't check out. I sat up slowly, the kind of movement men my age reserve for final decisions. Do you have visual? I asked. Yes, sir. I can patch it to your phone. Seconds later, my hallway appeared, grainy, fluorescent, painfully honest. Ryan, Elena, and a third man kneeling with a toolkit, the polite posture of someone paid not to ask questions. I breathed once, then again. It's strange how steady life gets when you've already survived death once. Call building security, I said, and record everything. Already done, the concierge replied. Would you like us to notify the police? Not yet, I said. Let's see which script they're reading from. On screen, Ryan gestured impatiently, whispering something sharp. The locksmith hesitated, looking up at Elena for moral clearance he'd never receive. The lock didn't turn. Mr. Riley, bless his precision, stepped into frame. Calm, uniformed, the physical embodiment of enough. Evening, he said, voice even. No maintenance tonight. Buildings closed. Ryan straightened, trying to salvage confidence. You're mistaken. We're on the tenant list. Not anymore, Riley said. Elena flinched. We just want to talk to my father. Then call him, Riley said. But you're not coming through this door. Ryan exhaled. Not surrender, calculation. You're overstepping. I'm standing, Riley replied. Different thing. The locksmith slowly packed up his tools, reading the air better than the man paying him. I watched it unfold from my bed, the way surgeons watch monitors. Detached, analytical, invested only in survival. When they finally left, Riley stayed until the elevator doors closed. He looked up at the camera, at me, and gave a small nod. Protocol completed. I called the concierge back. Thank you, I said. We'll sweep the floor, he replied. Do you want additional patrol? That won't change the wind, I said. He didn't ask what I meant. Men in his line of work learn not to. At 1:17 a.m. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number, though the tone was familiar. If you insist on making this ugly, we'll petition for guardianship. You're not well. Paperwork is easy. Judges are tired. Choose peace. I stared at the screen. It takes a special kind of arrogance to weaponize concern. I forwarded the message to Rachel. Her reply came 30 seconds later. Logged. Keep your phone on. You're not alone. I set the phone down, exhaled through my teeth, and whispered, You learn the shape of love by watching how it dies. At 2:04 a.m., another buzz, this time an email from a messenger service. Attachment, incident, report, PDF, sevens. I opened it. A complaint, drafted like concern, accusing me of erratic behavior, financial instability, and vulnerability to manipulation. Sevens. The signature at the bottom, Ryan Carter. I smiled. Not wide. Just enough to remind my pulse I was still in charge. Evidence is beautiful even when it's ugly. I forwarded it to Rachel with one line. He just signed his own affidavit. Her response came within minutes. Good. We'll fold it into the file. Go back to bed. I tried. Sleep arrived late but obedient, like an intern learning respect. At 3:01 a.m., the knock came. 2 measured taps, the kind that expects to be let in. I stayed still. Who is it? Front desk, a man's voice said. 2 visitors requesting you by name. My name isn't on this room, I said. A pause. Then, that's what makes it interesting. The tone was polite, but not hotel polite. More human, tired, complicit. I chose my words carefully. Tell them the guest they're looking for chose sleep. If they persist, offer them a seat in the lobby with a camera that works. Another pause. Understood, sir. The footsteps receded. Silence returned. But it didn't stay. A minute later, another knock. Softer, closer. I looked through the peephole. Ryan, hair unkempt, eyes wide, voice lowered. Dad, please, he said. We need to talk. Off the record. Temptation is a strange thing at my age. You start believing conversations can fix what actions already finalized. Say it through the door, I said. He hesitated, looked up at the hallway camera, then back at me. Really? Really. He sighed, the kind of sound that belongs to men losing their audience. This is out of control, he said. You're making it worse. You're not thinking straight. I'm thinking in order, I said. You should try it sometime. He pressed his forehead against the door. I didn't mean for this to happen. Intent doesn't dilute poison, I said. Silence. Then the shuffle of retreat. The elevator dinged. The hallway returned to its preferred state. Empty. I sat down, heart steady, mind clean. I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had deadlines. Mine had expired. Before dawn, I called Rachel. Log everything, I said. File the messages, the footage, the knock. If they file for guardianship, I want the court to have a time-stamped rebuttal waiting before they finish their coffee. You'll have it, she said. Good, I replied, because I'm done reacting. From now on, they answer to structure. I ended the call, opened the blinds, and let morning in. The sky was the color of forgiveness. Pale, almost believable. But forgiveness wasn't on my schedule. Correction was. Morning arrived without apology. The kind of light that doesn't heal so much as reveal what's left. I brewed coffee I didn't plan to drink. The ritual mattered more than the caffeine. By 7, I was on a call with Rachel. Her tone was surgical. We have enough evidence to file 3 separate actions, she said. Criminal, civil, and preemptive injunctions. File the 3rd first, I said. Criminals chase noise. I prefer silence. Then already in motion, she said. I'm sending a courier to collect the security footage and your phone logs. The petition for guardianship won't survive breakfast. I smiled. Efficiency looks good on you, Rachel. It looks better on paper, she said. 2 hours later, I was sitting in her office again. The blinds were half open. Sunlight fell across stacks of legal documents like quiet spotlighting on a stage that only truth could perform on. Rachel was already mid-sentence with her assistant. File the restraining order, tag the affidavit, and cross-reference the timestamps from the concierge call. Her precision was almost beautiful, the poetry of competence. She looked up. "You all right?" "I'm functional," I said. "At this age, that's close enough to fine." She smirked, then pushed a folder toward me. "Here's the draft for the injunction. Once signed, Ryan can't approach you, contact you, or attempt financial interference. Any breach triggers immediate asset freeze and civil liability." "Perfect," I said. "Let's give him paperwork worth fearing." By noon, my signature had turned into a verdict. The system that had once failed me was now my weapon. Rachel stood, stretching. "That covers immediate safety. Now we clean the rest. Your legacy files, insurance, end-of-life directives. You ready for that conversation?" "Always," I said. "The living should handle death before it starts taking notes." She opened another folder, thicker this time. "These are the old documents naming Ryan as secondary trustee and Elena as successor beneficiary. We're replacing both. New trustee, the Margaret Hale Foundation. Secondary, independent fiduciary firm." "Good," I said. "Let institutions handle what blood couldn't." At 2:00 p.m., the banker from Everline Capital joined us by video call. Same man who once smiled too much. His tone now was pure compliance. "Mr. Hale, all beneficiary designations are updated. All previous parties have been removed. The trust and foundation accounts are live. Your son-in-law no longer exists in our system." "Look, that's the cleanest sentence I've heard all week," I said. Rachel muted the line and looked at me. "We'll still monitor any digital attempts. People like him don't give up quietly." "That's fine," I said. "Noise can't touch clean code." After he left the screen, Rachel slid a thinner envelope toward me. "One last form," she said. "The new will. Points everything to the foundation and outlines how distributions go to Elena. Education, health, recovery. Nothing in cash. Nothing liquid." I nodded. "Liquid things tend to get poisoned." She smiled softly. "You're funny when you're healed." "I'm not healed," I said. "I'm documented." We both laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only thing the room hadn't seen in weeks. By the time the courier returned, I'd signed more paper than some men read in a lifetime. Every clause, every stamp, every notarized line, each one another layer of distance between me and chaos. Rachel gathered them neatly. "All done. Everything filed, sealed, and cross-referenced. You're insulated." "From him?" I asked. "From everyone," she said gently. "Even from love, if you're not careful." I nodded. "I'll risk it. Love had poor aim anyway." Before leaving, I looked out her window, the city below alive and unaware. Cars moved, people hurried, the world kept spending time like it was renewable. "Do you ever wonder," I said, "if justice is just revenge with better handwriting?" Rachel paused, considering. "Maybe," she said, "but you made it look cleaner than most." At home, I locked the safe again, slower this time. Inside, the foundation charter, the trust, the letter, the recordings, and the truth, all filed, sealed, untouchable. I poured a glass of water, stared at the way light refracted through it. It wasn't victory I felt. It was hygiene, the emotional kind, the kind that makes you realize you can't disinfect the past, but you can sterilize the future. The phone buzzed once, Rachel again. "All filed. Guardianship petition denied. They're out of moves." I replied. "Then I'm out of fear." That night, I slept for 6 straight hours. No dreams, no ghosts, just a steady pulse and a clean conscience. Somewhere between law and mercy, I'd found balance. And balance, I realized, is just another word for peace, the kind you can prove in writing. The morning after the filings, the city felt different, washed, rinsed, as if someone had finally opened a window after a long argument. I stood by the window of my apartment, coffee cooling in my hand, and realized the silence didn't sound empty anymore. It sounded earned. The documents were done, the signatures sealed, the money safe. And for the first time in months, my heartbeat belonged to no one's schedule but my own. I decided to walk, not toward anything, just away from the kind of rooms that remember. The park sat at the edge of downtown, where the new trees from the Margaret Hale Foundation had been planted. It still smelled of wet earth and promise. A few city workers were setting up benches along the path. Plain wood, no plaques, no donors' names carved into their backs. That had been my only instruction. Anonymous comfort. One of the workers recognized me from the foundation paperwork. "Mr. Hale," he said, smiling. "You came to see your trees." "They're not mine," I said. "I just made the introduction." He laughed softly and went back to tightening bolts. I found a bench under a young oak whose branches shook like they were still learning confidence. I sat down and listened to the city breathing. Traffic, pigeons, a distant siren that didn't belong to me anymore. In my coat pocket, I carried a single envelope. The letter. Elena's name still written across the front in my handwriting. Steady, deliberate, final. I hadn't given it to her yet. I wasn't sure if I would. Some truths don't need witnesses. They just need a place to rest. I opened it and read it again, quietly, to the trees. The paper had softened at the folds, like it had memorized my hands. "You can still build something with me, just not out of me." The lines still landed like truth, not sharp, not gentle, just inevitable. The air shifted. A breeze rolled through the leaves, the sound small but confident. I thought of Margaret. She would have liked this place, the unpretentiousness, the absence of self-congratulation. She used to say, "If you do something good, make sure nobody knows whose idea it was." That's how she lived. That's how I should have. The trees swayed again, as if agreeing. I smiled at the thought. The old man having a conversation with wind. My phone buzzed once. A message from Rachel. Foundation account active. First grants approved. Food bank, community laptop program, and reforestation team funded. Congratulations, Edward. I typed back, no congratulations, just continuation. Then, a second message appeared, from an unknown number. I knew the tone before I even read it. Therapy started. Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Will show up. E. No apology. No plea. Just attendance. Sometimes, that's the closest thing to redemption you get. I typed only 2 words back. Keep showing. Then I set the phone face down beside me. A child ran past, chasing a red ball, his laughter cutting through the air like forgiveness that hadn't learned to be careful yet. His mother followed, shouting his name, her voice warm and impatient in equal measure. I watched them go until the sound faded into distance. There was peace in that, the kind that doesn't ask permission. I leaned back against the bench and let the sun find my face. The wood was still warm from someone else's afternoon. That's the trick about healing. You never get to be the first to sit in it. The city carried on, unbothered, unapologetic. Cars moved like sentences finding their own endings. Above me, the young oak trembled again, and for a moment, I could almost hear Margaret's voice in the leaves. Call it done, Ed. Then go do the next right small thing. I whispered back, all right. I sat there until the light changed color, from gold to copper to something that looked like peace if you didn't stare too hard. Then I stood, brushed the dust from my sleeve, and looked at the bench one last time. No plaque, no initials, just wood, shade, and silence doing exactly what they were built to do. As I walked away, I realized something simple. 7s. I hadn't won. There was no scoreboard, no vengeance tally, no applause. But I'd done what men like me are built to do: restore function. And when justice works, it doesn't roar. It hums quietly, like a well-tuned machine or a life finally back in sync. That night, I slept with the window open. No locks checked twice. No nightmares cued. Just the wind moving through the trees outside. The kind my wife once planted. The kind my foundation now would. The city forgot me again. That was the reward I'd been building toward all along. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.